My name is Alara Hughes, and I am 35 years old. This all happened on the August bank holiday, the day my father chose to stage my public execution in his Notting Hill garden. If you've ever had a relative use a celebratory event to tear down your biggest achievements, hit that like button right now. Your support fuels this story, and I promise you, the payoff is worth the wait. Pay attention to the call I take, because it wasn't just my father who lost his voice that day. It was his entire entitled world. The air was thick and sweet with the smell of expensive barbecue smoke and the cloying scent of my father's pride. Richard Hughes, my father, was a man who lived his life as a perfectly staged performance, and his annual bank holiday garden party was his season finale. He stood next to the industrial-grade chrome grill, wielding a pair of tongs like a conductor's baton, surrounded by a crowd of his peers, minor property developers, a few retired barristers, and the wives who polished their husbands' egos for a living. I was standing near the edge of the manicured lawn, sipping a perfectly dry white wine, listening to a group of my father's friends discuss the latest property prices on the high street. I'd flown in from Manhattan just 12 hours earlier, the jet lag a dull, throbbing headache behind my eyes, but I knew I had to be here. My brother Marcus, the golden child, was draped over a chaise lounge, already slightly tipsy on artisanal gin, holding court with a giggling woman about the challenges of managing a legacy portfolio, which was his delicate way of saying he spent his days approving lavish invoices for Dad's floundering property management firm. Then the inevitable spotlight found me. My father, spotting me by the rose bushes, clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and loud enough to cut through the smooth jazz piped from the outdoor speakers. "Ah, there she is, the prodigal daughter," he boomed, his voice carrying exactly the right amount of forced joviality and underlying malice. He waited for the group around him to turn, ensuring he had maximum audience capacity. "Everyone, this is Alara. Alara, you remember Derek, don't you? His son Charles just made partner at Slaughter and May, a proper London success story." I offered a small, polite smile. "Congratulations to Charles, Derek." The words were barely out of my mouth before my father leaned in conspiratorially, but loud enough for a 5-meter radius to hear. Alara here. She decided the family business, the real, tangible, legacy business, wasn't quite exciting enough. She went off to America. To... What was it again, sweetheart? Global strategy at some investment fund. He made the words investment fund sound like a children's playgroup, then finished with the line that was the entire reason for the performance. Left a secure future to play with other people's money. Bless her heart. You really failed at life, didn't you, Alara? You chose the paper chase over the inheritance. The surrounding laughter was a polite, brittle tinkle, the sound of people indulging a rich man's cruelty. Marcus snickered from his lounge chair. My father's eyes, a cold, piercing blue, fixed on mine, demanding to see the familiar flicker of shame or retreat that had always defined our interactions. He had used his yard as a stage for my public mockery, a final pronouncement on my supposed lack of substance. But that girl, the one who retreated, was long gone. The woman standing on his lawn had spent the last 7 years forging a life from cold, hard global finance. She saw not a garden party but a balance sheet, and a very, very weak one at that. I kept the smile steady, but before I could deliver the single, cutting response I'd rehearsed, the phone in my silk skirt pocket vibrated. Once, twice. The ringtone, a short, sharp chime I only used for work, pulled my attention away from the performance. I pulled it out, and the light of the screen hit my father's face, catching the arrogant gleam in his eyes. He hated when attention shifted away from him. He hated the interruption. He opened his mouth, no doubt to make another joke about my work-life balance, but the words died in his throat. The entire yard, filled with the polite hum of Notting Hill elite, fell silent. I didn't need to answer the call yet. All I needed to do was show him the screen. The name flashed on the display in large, unmistakable characters, a name that, once seen and recognized by the 1 or 2 old-money bankers present, instantly ended his arrogant speech. The name was Lord Alastair Cromwell. Cromwell. The chairman of Blackwood Global, the largest and most ruthless investment fund in the entire city. My father knew the name. Everyone in British property knew the name. It was the name that signed off on deals that reshaped entire skylines, deals that were spoken of in whispers and fear. But they didn't know the connection. they only knew the weight of the name. Lord Cromwell was calling me Alara Hughes, the girl who failed at life. My father's face, a second ago flushed with celebratory dominance, drained of all color, leaving him looking like a badly preserved marble statue. The fork he was holding halfway to his plate froze solid, suspended over a meticulously arranged sausage. He blinked once, twice, his mind visibly racing to process the sight of the most powerful figure in UK finance calling his daughter, the daughter he just publicly minimized. The silence was perfect, dense, and full of a terror that only a man whose entire life was built on perception could feel when that perception was about to crumble. He hadn't just joked about my failure. He had insulted the one man who, at that very moment, held the keys to his entire existence. It was poetic. It was devastating. And it was exactly what I had been waiting for. I had spent the last 7 years building a vault around my heart and a fortress around my career. My childhood, spent in the drafty, respectable silence of our Notting Hill townhouse, was a masterclass in learning to exist in the shadow of male entitlement. It wasn't just my father who perpetuated the hierarchy. It was the entire ecosystem of his inherited, insular London world. My brother Marcus, 3 years my junior, was the sole repository of the Hughes legacy. From the moment he first picked up a tiny wooden golf club, his path was gilded. Every success was celebrated with a bottle of Dom Perignon. Every failure was excused as a moment of creative genius. My straight A's at the London School of Economics? They were just Alara being Alara, the steady, responsible one who would eventually serve as the quiet ballast for Marcus's grand, but inevitably chaotic, vision. The firm, Hughes & Sons Property Management, was the golden calf. Founded by my grandfather, it managed a portfolio of small but stable commercial properties across London's commuter belt. The Sons part was the key, and my existence was merely to prop up the structure until Marcus was ready to take the reins. I remember the day I came home with my first job offer, a highly coveted graduate role at a top investment bank in Canary Wharf, the financial heart of the city, a place Dad considered vulgar and new money. He didn't even look up from his copy of the Financial Times. "Waste of a good LSE degree, Alara," he'd muttered. "You should be learning the real business. The family business. These American funds you're obsessed with, they're just paper pushers. No heritage, no substance." His words, always aimed to wound, had the opposite effect. They acted as a fuel I didn't know I needed. They pushed me to seek substance where he saw only surface. I took the job, not just in Canary Wharf, but eventually accepting the transfer to New York, putting 3,500 miles and an ocean between myself and the stifling arrogance of his world. In New York, I flourished. Away from the pressure to be the quiet helper, I became Alara Hughes, senior strategist, specializing in hostile takeovers and portfolio restructuring. My job was to see the rot beneath the veneer, the weakness in the structure, and then move in with surgical, deadly precision. I learned how ownership could be moved, how legacy could be liquidated, and how emotion had no place on a balance sheet. I was a weapon, and my training had been paid for by the very person who now mocked my career. I kept up appearances, the dutiful daughter who came home for Christmas and the bank holiday. I always sent a ridiculous gift for Marcus's birthday, and I always called Dad on his birthday. But underneath that facade, I was watching. I had access to the kind of industry data Dad's small, outdated firm couldn't even dream of. I knew his firm's debt-to-equity ratio was critical. I knew his biggest tenants were quietly exploring buyouts. And most crucially, I knew that Marcus, bless his golden boy heart, was bleeding the company dry with management expenses, a term that, in reality, funded his crippling gambling debt and his collection of vintage Italian scooters. Over the last 2 years, I had quietly directed a massive global investment fund into the specific niche market of mid-sized UK property management firms. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a strategy. I was hunting the weakness in the herd, and that weakness was named Hughes & Sons. The man on the phone, Lord Alistair Cromwell, wasn't just my boss. He was my final necessary weapon. He was the one who signed the checks, the one who provided the impenetrable corporate shield, and the one who had given me a singular, career-defining mission. Alara, you find the target, you devise the strategy, and you execute the final stroke. Bring it down or bring it into the fold. but I want it done by the end of the year. He didn't know the personal stakes, and I never told him. He only knew I was the most efficient, coldest strategist on his payroll. That phone call, freezing the entire party, was the final, devastating piece of my carefully constructed plan. I had taken 7 years to turn his joke about my paper chase into the very document that would destroy his life. And as I looked at his ashen face, the only thing I felt was the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally paid. I needed every single person watching this video to understand the depth of that betrayal, because without it, the vengeance and the strange turn it takes won't make sense. And if you've ever had a professional triumph dismissed by the people you desperately sought approval from, let me know in the comments below what your quiet, strategic revenge was. I read every single one of your stories, and trust me, they matter more than you know. The moment I left the firm, my father's firm, the supposed cradle of my legacy, I felt a shift in the tectonic plates of my life. It was a deliberate, surgical break, one that he dismissed as childish rebellion. But it wasn't rebellion. It was the establishment of sovereignty. The true nature of the betrayal, the rot beneath the veneer of the Hughes legacy, only fully revealed itself 6 months ago, during a fleeting visit back to London under the guise of an extended holiday. I wasn't there for a holiday, I was there for due diligence. Blackwood Global had tasked me with scouting acquisition targets in the UK market, and I had deliberately, methodically guided them towards the sector where Dad's firm operated. I wasn't just looking to acquire, I was looking to understand the fragility of the structure that had controlled my life. I used my residual knowledge of his systems and my current expertise in financial forensics to gain access to his firm's public filings, deep diving into the accounts payable and vendor contracts. What I found was far worse than mismanagement. It was slow, institutionalized theft that was threatening to implode the entire company, taking innocent people with it. The property management firm had over 200 employees, people who relied on their paychecks to cover mortgages in Reading and tuition fees in Guildford. They were the ones who truly kept the legacy afloat, the silent workforce whose value was never acknowledged by my father or my brother. The theft, the deep betrayal, came in 2 distinct, devastating layers. First, there was Dad. He had been leveraging the firm's main commercial asset, a block of 1930s flats in Kentish Town, as collateral for personal loans to keep his lifestyle afloat, specifically to maintain the fiction of his wealth to his social circle. He hadn't just joked about my career, he was gambling the firm's future on his pride. He'd signed off on a high-interest bridge loan disguised as a strategic partnership, the paperwork so dense and misleading that only a trained eye like mine could trace the funds back to his personal offshore accounts. He was systematically extracting value from the company's core assets, leaving the firm a hollow shell. The second layer was Marcus. The management expenses weren't just for scooters and gambling. Marcus had been issuing fake vendor invoices, primarily through a shell company registered in the Isle of Man, run by a college friend. These invoices were for ludicrously inflated technology consulting and digital strategy services the firm never actually received. Over 18 months, my brother had siphoned close to £1 million from the firm's operating budget. £1 million that should have gone into reserves, into employee pensions, or into necessary building maintenance. He had turned the firm into his personal ATM, protected by the shield of the son who could do no wrong. I sat in a rented flat in Chelsea, staring at the printouts, the forged signatures, the wire transfer receipts, the fraudulent asset stripping, and I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. The vengeance wasn't just about my father's mockery. It was about the ethical violation, the betrayal of trust to the 200-plus employees who were about to lose everything because of 2 men's arrogance and greed. My initial plan was simple: acquire the firm, liquidate the non-performing assets, Dad's properties, fire Marcus, and let my father deal with the legal and financial fallout of his bridge loan. It was going to be clean, cold, and final. But the scale of the employee dependency changed everything. It became a moral problem disguised as a business transaction. I realized then that my revenge couldn't just be about dismantling his life. It had to be about forcing him to witness the true cost of his actions, and then, at the very last moment, showing him a power he didn't understand, the power to choose mercy over complete destruction. The acquisition, therefore, had to be hostile, public, and devastatingly effective. It needed to be executed so cleanly that there was no room for denial, no time for him to scramble a defense. The only way to achieve that level of precision was through the chairman himself, Lord Cromwell. And that's when I picked up my phone and drafted the acquisition strategy memo that would eventually land on his desk, outlining the immediate, catastrophic risk to Hughes & Sons and the specific surgical strategy to take control. The strategy I outlined to Lord Cromwell was named Project Chimera because it was a construct of two opposing natures, brutal financial aggression and quiet humanitarian preservation. My goal was no longer merely to seize the company, it was to seize it in a manner that created maximum public shockwave, satisfying the core desire for vengeance while simultaneously protecting the firm's employees from the fallout, the reconciliation that my family would never comprehend. The initial memo was a masterpiece of cold corporate language. I detailed the firm's precarious debt structure, the non-performing assets, Dad's leveraged properties, and the systemic cash leakage, Marcus's ghost invoices. I argued that the only way to avoid a messy public bankruptcy, which would damage the wider market, was an immediate, aggressive acquisition of the controlling shares, bypassing the board, which was essentially Dad's cronies. The key was timing and secrecy. Lord Cromwell loved it. He loved the efficiency, the speed, and the ruthlessness. He approved the budget and assigned the legal team. What he didn't know was the personal timeline I was working against. I timed the final stages of the acquisition, the mandatory public announcement of the controlling stake transfer, to fall precisely on the August bank holiday weekend. I knew my father's party would be filled with the very people whose opinions mattered most to him, the landlords, the minor gentry, the industry peers who formed his entire social currency. The public mockery he planned for me would be instantly countered by the public collapse of his entire persona. The legal work took months. We used a subsidiary acquisition vehicle, shielded by layers of offshore holdings, making the true buyer, Blackwood Global, impossible to trace until the very last minute. I flew to Geneva, Frankfurt, and Dublin, meeting with various corporate lawyers, coordinating the quiet purchase of all outstanding minority shares. Each signature was a tiny, invisible hammer blow against the foundation of Hughes & Sons. I designed the final, devastating move, a poison pill clause triggered upon the acquisition of 51% of the shares. This clause would immediately transfer the firm's operational control from the current board, Dad, to the CEO of the acquiring entity, me, though my name was still hidden beneath 2 layers of corporate titles. It was a legal move that rendered any last-minute counter-strategy by my father completely useless. The entire operation was a silent siege, and the barbecue was the day the walls came down. I had meticulously crafted every detail, including the specific timing of the final, crucial conference call. Lord Cromwell, as chairman, was only needed for the final 1-minute confirmation call, the single approval that would initiate the public regulatory filing. This was the call I received at the barbecue. I had ensured his number was saved in my phone with his name in all caps, Lord Alastair Cromwell. It wasn't just a powerful name. It was the name of the man who was signing the death warrant for Hughes & Sons, a warrant I had personally written. The genius of the structure, the machine learning pattern I replicated from the Champion scripts, was the delayed gratification. The first part gave the audience the shock of the moment. The middle parts gave them the intricate, satisfying details of the plan, the intellectual revenge that makes the protagonist a genius, not a victim. The final part would deliver the public climax, followed by the unexpected resolution. But the most critical part of the vengeance was what would come after the firm was mine. Once the dust settled, my father would be financially ruined, his personal properties seized by the bridge loan creditor, and Marcus would be jobless and facing potential fraud charges. This was the deserved punishment. But the reconciliation, the true, unexpected twist, was my final internal mandate. I would not allow the 200 innocent employees to suffer. Once I was in charge, I would immediately shut down the fraudulent practices, stabilize the firm, and initiate a massive internal investigation, but I would use my power to keep the firm operational. I would offer Marcus a job, not as the son, but as a low-level analyst reporting directly to me, earning his way back from the ground up, with his salary based purely on performance. I would use the acquisition to save the employee's future, and to force my brother into a lifetime of honest work, under my scrutiny. It was a far more fascinating, torturous form of justice than simple ruination. And it ensured that the Hughes name, while humiliated, would not be synonymous with utter financial collapse, offering a path to quiet, earned redemption. The day of the barbecue was a masterclass in false confidence. The weather was inappropriately perfect for London in late August, and the garden was awash in the kind of golden light that only highlights surface-level perfection. I had chosen my outfit with the same precision I chose my target companies: a severe dark silk dress that signaled finance, and an icy, detached composure that signaled unapproachable. I didn't want conversation. I wanted observation. My father, Richard, was in peak form, wearing an expensive linen shirt that barely concealed his expanding waistline, playing the convivial host, while his internal life was a ticking time bomb. The air was buzzing with the casual arrogance of people who believed their social standing was unassailable. I watched Marcus, my golden boy brother, who looked distinctly nervous under his veneer of swagger. He kept checking his phone, a twitch betraying his anxiety. I knew why. I had silently directed my legal team to freeze a small but significant shell account he used for his more extravagant betting habits just 48 hours earlier. It wasn't enough to stop the acquisition, but it was enough to make him uncomfortable, unsure, and off balance. The mockery, when it came, was meticulously orchestrated by Dad. He waited until his old school friend Sir Geoffrey, a retired judge who still commanded respect in their circle, was within earshot. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a performance for the only jury Dad cared about. His joke about my failed life and choosing paper over inheritance landed exactly where he intended: a public dismissal of my success as hollow and transient. It was a projection of his own fear, that his tangible, decades-old legacy was about to be obliterated by my intangible 7-year-old career. And then, the ring. The sharp, unexpected chime of my work phone. The sound was an alien intrusion in the placid, expensive garden. I pulled the phone out, and for a long, agonizing second, I simply held it, letting the name Lord Alastair Cromwell glow on the screen, a luminous, deadly truth. I saw the moment of recognition flicker across Dad's face. First, confusion. Why would Lord Cromwell call Alara? Then sheer, debilitating fear. What could the chairman of Blackwood Global possibly want with anyone at this garden party? He must have been aware of the recent quiet market chatter about Blackwood's interest in the mid-size property sector. He must have recognized the predator closing in. His mouth opened to speak, to demand I put the phone away, to reassert control over his stage, but the voice refused to come out. His eyes were wide, fixed on the screen like a man watching a train bearing down on him. The silence was palpable, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the manicured space. I lifted the phone slowly to my ear, my eyes locked on my father's, a final, cold acknowledgement of his defeat. I pressed the answer icon. I didn't say my usual precise greeting. I didn't say, "Hello, Lord Cromwell." I said exactly 3 words, loud enough for the paralyzed knot of people around us to hear, especially the older gentlemen who were now leaning in, their faces masks of stunned disbelief. The first 2 words were the formal greeting, and the third was the lethal, unadorned statement of intent. The opening move that signaled the end of the game. I spoke into the phone, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly articulated, a deliberate contrast to the chaos and panic unfolding in my father's eyes. I said, "Good afternoon, Chairman. Initiate." The word initiate was the code word. It meant the legal team had received the final, crucial sign-off from the chairman. It meant the acquisition, Project Chimera, was now live. The regulatory filings were being sent. The public press release was being drafted. In the next 60 seconds, Hughes & Sons property management would cease to be his. The look on his face shifted from fear to a horrifying, dawning comprehension. He knew. He knew that the daughter he mocked for her paper chase was now holding the papers that would liquidate his entire legacy. Marcus, who had finally staggered over, saw the name, heard the word initiate, and his face went just as white as Dad's, a shared, catastrophic realization dawning between the 2 men. I held the phone to my ear for only 37 seconds, long enough for the key phrases to be spoken and confirmed. Lord Cromwell, a man of lethal efficiency, simply said, "Confirmed. You are now the controlling director. The filings are live. Congratulations, Alara." He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The transaction was clean, ruthless, and complete. I lowered the phone, not hanging up, but placing it gently against my chest, and I let the silence stretch for another full minute. I watched the faces. My father, Richard, was trembling, his hand still frozen over his plate, the tongs finally slipping from his grip with a faint metallic clatter. The sound broke the silence, but did nothing to release the tension. Marcus, pale and visibly sweating, was the first to speak, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "Ilara? What did you just initiate? That's Cromwell. What are you doing?" His fear was almost gratifying, but I ignored him. My focus was entirely on my father, the man who had taught me that in this world, control was the only language that mattered. I finally spoke, my voice low and level, projecting a cold authority that was utterly alien to the daughter he thought he knew. "I just finalized the acquisition of 51% of Hughes & Sons Property Management," I stated, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of a 500-page legal document. Effective immediately, the board of directors has been dissolved, and operational control has been transferred to Blackwood Global's restructuring division. I have been appointed as the new managing director. The polite, brittle group of guests who moments ago were laughing at my expense now stood completely motionless, their wine glasses suspended, their smiles extinguished. Derek, the man whose son was the proper London success story, looked between my father and me with a mixture of horror and awe. This wasn't a family row. This was a corporate coup d'etat being executed over artisanal sausages in a private garden. It was the kind of event that would be whispered about in the city for years. Richard finally moved. He dropped his fork, the noise startling, and he lunged toward me, his face twisted in a mask of impotent rage and disbelief. "You traitor! You absolute viper! You did this? You spent 7 years plotting to steal your own father's legacy?" His voice cracked, losing its commanding tone, sounding thin and pathetic in the open air. I took a deliberate step back, maintaining a professional distance. "It was never your legacy, Dad," I corrected him calmly. "It was Grandpa's, and you ran it into the ground." "I didn't steal a legacy. I acquired a distressed asset. The bridge loan you took out against the Kentish town property? The one that was due to default in 2 weeks? Blackwood Global now owns that debt. And the 18 months of fraudulent invoices filed by your son, Marcus? I have every receipt, every wire transfer, every detail of the shell company he used to drain the operating budget. I know exactly where the firm's liquidity went, and it wasn't into building repairs." I pulled a single folded piece of paper from my pocket, the new organizational chart. It was the final devastating flourish. I held it out to him, but didn't let him take it. "You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal effects from the office, Richard. The lawyers will contact you regarding your personal assets that were leveraged against the firm. Marcus, I'll need you to report to my new head of internal audit first thing Monday morning, not as the heir, not as the prodigal son, but as an employee under review." Marcus, hearing his name and the phrase fraudulent invoices, looked like he might vomit. He stumbled back, his perfect linen shirt suddenly looking like a cheap shroud. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with ruin. The guests began to shift, moving away, grabbing their coats, their faces fixed on the ground, desperate to escape the immediate vicinity of a spectacular, catastrophic failure. Richard Hughes, the man who thrived on public dominance, was standing in his own meticulously cared-for garden, utterly, publicly undone by the daughter he declared a failure. The vengeance was complete. I had not only taken his company, I had taken the one thing he valued most, his standing in front of his peers. The hours that followed the call were a blur of cold, calculated corporate cleansing. My father, Richard, retreated into the house, slamming the French doors behind him. He didn't emerge again. Marcus, after a failed, tearful attempt to talk his way out of the misunderstanding, was physically escorted out of the garden by one of my newly deployed, very large, very quiet security consultants. The party evaporated instantly. Guests left their half-eaten food and full glasses of champagne, fleeing the scene of what felt less like a celebration and more like a Greek tragedy played out in a high-end postcode. By 4 p.m., the only people left were me, the security team, and 2 very serious-looking corporate lawyers from Blackwood Global, who were already drafting an employee-wide email about the change in ownership and the stabilization plan. The vengeance, the pure cold justice of it, was a heady, intoxicating thing. I had achieved what 7 years of silent work had prepared me for, the absolute total dismantling of the structure that had suffocated me. That night, I didn't return to the hotel. I went straight to the Hughes & Sons headquarters in Victoria, a solid, uninspired building that smelled perpetually of old paper and my father's outdated cologne. The lawyers were already there, and we worked until the early hours of the morning, changing all the locks, seizing the servers, and securing the financial records. Every piece of data I needed to prosecute Marcus for fraud was now in my hands. Every piece of documentation proving Dad's reckless asset stripping was now part of my portfolio. I had achieved the absolute corporate kill. But as the clock ticked past midnight, and I looked at the framed, outdated family photo on my father's now empty desk, a photo of a younger, softer me, standing stiffly next to a grinning, oblivious Marcus, the sense of triumph began to feel hollow. This wasn't just about ruin, it was about the 200 employees. It was about the lives that would be destroyed by the simple closure of the firm, which was the inevitable next step if Blackwood Global treated this as a standard hostile takeover. My vengeance against my father and brother was complete, but the true victims were the men and women who had shown up every day believing they were building a secure future. And that's where the final, unexpected act of mercy, the strategic reconciliation, began. I called Lord Cromwell in New York at 6 a.m. London time, knowing he would be at his desk. I bypassed the standard update and went straight to my proposal. Sir, I have secured 51% control. The assets are in severe distress exactly as predicted. We can liquidate and fold the client base into another subsidiary for maximum return. I paused, letting the default corporate path sink in. Then I delivered the final, most unexpected part of Project Chimera. Alternatively, I propose we use this firm as a flagship for a new, ethically focused division. We keep the employees, restructure the debt using Blackwood's capital, and turn Hughes & Sons into a model of corporate responsibility. The PR value alone will be massive, and it forces the former leadership, Richard and Marcus, to face the consequences not of financial ruin, but of honest, earned work. I explained my plan for Marcus, placing him under an internal audit for a year, then offering him a severely demoted analyst position with a performance-based salary, a chance for him to finally, genuinely, learn the value of a pound earned, not inherited. It was a hell of a lot harder and more effective than simply tossing him into the street. Cromwell was silent for a long moment, a silence that could freeze oceans. You're proposing to trade short-term capital gains for long-term ethical restructuring, driven by what exactly, Alara? I gave him the only answer that mattered to a man like him. Control. Full, unassailable control. And the public relations narrative of saving an entire workforce from a family's greed is worth 10 times the liquidation value, sir. I will be the face of the restructuring. I will clean it up. I will run it. He chuckled, a dry, sharp sound. You're a brilliant, cold-blooded strategist, Alara. But you have a sliver of your grandfather's heart. Very well, the decision is yours. Clean house, but keep the name. And the terms for your brother's employment? They are acceptable. Use him. Break him down and build him back up. See if he learns. The permission was granted. My vengeance, I realized, was not complete until I had forced them both, my father and my brother, to understand the real meaning of responsibility. The next morning, the news hit the London financial press like a thunderclap. Blackwood Global acquires distressed property manager in hostile bank holiday coup. The articles were filled with breathless speculation, focusing on the ruthless efficiency of the move. My father, Richard, was immediately quoted, an old statement from 6 months prior about the firm's unshakable foundations that now read as pure, tragic irony. His humiliation was complete, not just a private matter, but a front-page spectacle witnessed by the entire city. He refused to answer my calls, as expected. He refused to leave his house, now a silent monument to his catastrophic hubris. Marcus, however, had no choice. He showed up at the Victoria office precisely at 9 a.m. on Monday, looking like he hadn't slept, wearing a suit that was clearly too expensive for the low-level HR meeting he was about to attend. He was escorted past me into the newly secured conference room, where my head of internal audit, a former forensic accountant from the Serious Fraud Office, was waiting. The process was cold, professional, and terrifyingly efficient. Marcus signed the documents admitting to the financial irregularities, agreeing to a full restitution plan, which would take the next decade of his life to pay off, and accepting the terms of his new probationary employment. Zero decision-making power, a salary barely above minimum wage, and direct reportage to me. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his arrogance entirely gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling humility I had never witnessed before. He walked past my office, saw me sitting at the head of the conference table directing my new team, and he didn't even meet my eye. He just nodded once, a gesture of quiet, broken submission, and walked out to begin his new, agonizingly honest life as the firm's newest, lowest-ranking data entry analyst. The vengeance against the father had been public and final. The revenge against the brother was to be a slow, persistent reclamation of his moral compass. The final, fascinating turn came 2 weeks later. I was in the Kentish Town office meeting with the site managers and tenants, reassuring them that their properties were safe, their jobs secure. I was standing in the lobby when my father, Richard, walked in. He looked 10 years older, his expensive clothes hanging loose on his frame. He wasn't aggressive or even angry, he was simply broken. He walked straight up to me, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look at me as his daughter or as a failure or as a rival. He looked at me as the person who had completely, utterly taken away his power. "They're going to seize the house, Ilara," he whispered, his voice dry and hollow. "The creditor called, the bridge loan. They want the keys by the end of the month." He was referring to his beautiful Notting Hill townhouse, the house that had been the backdrop to a lifetime of his staged performances. I had known this was coming. It was the direct legal consequence of his asset stripping. It was the price he paid for his pride. But I hadn't come for his house. I had come for his soul, or what was left of it. I looked him dead in the eye, and I said, "The house is gone, Dad. That was the collateral you signed away. The lawyers will handle the eviction." I watched the last flicker of hope die in his eyes. Then I delivered the line I had been holding on to for 7 long years, the line that contained the entire, brutal truth of my act of strategic mercy. But I didn't let the firm fail, Richard. I bought the firm. I saved the company you were about to bankrupt. I saved the 200 jobs you jeopardized, and I secured their pensions. The Hughes name will continue, not as a symbol of your inherited arrogance, but as a model of corporate stability. And Marcus, I continued, gesturing to a tiny cubicle in the corner where my brother was hunched over a spreadsheet, working harder than he ever had in his life. He's here. He's working. He's paying back the money he stole. He has a chance to earn his way back up, not as the heir, but as a man of honor if he chooses it. The full weight of my action hit him. I hadn't inflicted ruin. I had inflicted responsibility. I had given them a second chance at life, but only under the crushing weight of reality. The vengeance was complete, and the surprising outcome was not a happy ending, but a new, arduous beginning for all of us. My father stood there for a long time, looking from me to Marcus's cubicle, then back to me. His public defeat had led to the loss of his home and his identity, yet his name, his actual legacy, was preserved and purified by the person he had scorned. He finally nodded, a slow, heavy movement of acceptance. "You are better than I deserve, Ilara," he murmured, the words forced out, carrying a raw, painful truth. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for his job back. He simply turned, walked out of the office, and disappeared into the London afternoon. That was the final end of Richard Hughes, the dominant patriarch. The man who walked out was just Richard, a man learning what it meant to own nothing but his mistakes. I never saw him again in a professional capacity, but 6 months later, I received a small, handwritten card from a rented flat in Surrey. It wasn't an apology. It was a single line of acknowledgement. "I see things clearly now. Thank you." The house was sold, the money going directly to the bridge loan creditors. Marcus stayed. He worked. He became a fixture in the corner cubicle, quiet, focused, and diligent. He didn't like it. He often looked exhausted and defeated, but he showed up every day. He was earning his redemption, not through a dramatic, tearful family gathering, but through the soul-crushing monotony of honest, hard labor. My vengeance had not brought about total destruction, but a brutal, forced transformation. My father lost his pride and his home, but gained an unvarnished view of reality. My brother lost his gilded path, but gained the opportunity for a moral education. And I gained everything. I took the managing director role at the restructured Hughes & Sons, now Hughes & Hughes Strategy and Management, and for the first time, I was working for a purpose that was entirely my own, protecting the lives of the 200 people my family almost destroyed. I used Blackwood's capital to modernize the entire operation, instituting new ethical guidelines and a profit-sharing scheme for the employees. We opened 2 more offices in the Southeast that year. I no longer had to fly across the Atlantic for work. My kingdom was right here in London, built on my own terms. I kept the same small, quiet flat in Chelsea. But now, when I looked out the window at the city skyline, I no longer saw the imposing buildings of Canary Wharf or the grand houses of Notting Hill. I saw a system I had learned to master, a game I had won, not by playing by their rules, but by rewriting them with my own strategic, ethical precision. The shame that once defined my relationship with my family was gone, replaced by an ironclad confidence that no joke, no slight, no act of malice could ever touch. I was free, not because I had abandoned my family, but because I had forced them into a new, healthier existence where responsibility was mandatory and entitlement was extinct. The most powerful kind of justice is not the one that destroys, but the one that forces a life change. I made them change, and in doing so, I finally saved myself. And that is an ending more fascinating and final than any fairy tale. Now, after witnessing the end of the Hughes legacy and the start of a new, painfully earned life for my family, what do you believe was the most powerful move? The acquisition itself, or the decision to keep the company operational and force Marcus to earn his redemption in the corner cubicle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss the next story of high-stakes, high-impact family dynamics. I often reflect on the quiet, strategic victory, the kind that leaves no external scars but rewrites the internal DNA of a family. The ultimate lesson wasn't about money or power. It was about the profound difference between the illusion of substance and the reality of competence. My father had the illusion. I had the reality. The success of the restructured firm over the next few years was undeniable. We became the case study for Blackwood Global's new ethical acquisition division, a narrative that propelled my career to heights even Lord Cromwell grudgingly admired. I was now a managing director, an industry leader, and a woman who commanded respect, not through an inherited name, but through sheer, unassailable results. My personal life, once neglected in the pursuit of this massive, secret strategy, also settled into a rhythm of quiet, earned satisfaction. I bought a small, beautiful Victorian flat in Primrose Hill, overlooking the park. It had high ceilings and large windows that let in the kind of soft, diffused light that made the mornings feel gentle. I filled it with books, not status symbols. And I learned to value silence, the kind of silence that wasn't a punishment, but a restorative luxury, free from the noise of my father's constant validation-seeking and Marcus's reckless chaos. I would sometimes walk past the old Notting Hill house. It had been beautifully refurbished, the garden even more immaculate, now owned by a quiet, anonymous tech executive. It looked peaceful. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel triumph. I felt only the deep, clean peace of a chapter decisively closed. The weight of supporting, validating, and constantly rescuing my family was finally gone, and I could use that energy to build something truly stable. Marcus, in his cubicle, remained a constant, low-level presence. He was still the weakest link, the one who required the most oversight, but his diligence was unflagging. He never complained. He never rebelled. He simply did the work, day in and day out. The fear of what he had almost lost, coupled with the daily, inescapable awareness that the sister he once mocked was now his ultimate boss and financial warden, had transformed him into an employee who, for the first time, was earning his keep. He had lost his freedom, but gained a life structure. My father was living in that quiet flat in Surrey, doing minor, part-time consulting work, a ghost of the man who once commanded a garden full of sycophants. He had nothing left to manage, nothing left to mock. He was simply living his own life, forced to confront his failures without the shield of his inherited wealth. The path to their forgiveness wasn't a grand, tearful moment. It was the quiet, ongoing act of bearing witness to the consequences of their choices and finally accepting responsibility for their own lives. My final act of vengeance was to save them from themselves, a far more profound and lasting impact than any simple financial ruin could ever achieve. And the final truth of my journey? Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, but it also doesn't guarantee hatred. It guarantees connection. What you do with that connection, whether you choose to cut it, or whether you choose to use it to force a necessary change, that is the only thing that matters. I chose change. I chose strategy. And in the end, I chose a cold, hard, unvarnished form of reconciliation that was absolutely fascinating to execute, and which allowed me to finally, truly live.